actually by now, by McGill Press, but it will definitely published soon before the end of the year in the Outspoken series, edited by Santiago Zabala and Adrian Parr. And the title is The Ebb of the Old Liberal Order and the Horizon of New Possibilities for Freedom. I'm not going to read off the paper, at least not in its entirety and not from the beginning for sure. I'm just going to give a background as to why it was necessary to write something on this topic. So on the one hand, we have this reality of what is supposed to be the liberal order, or the globalized order of the Western tradition of liberal democracy, and what is known to be the modern state. And here I'm referring to the civilizational invention, let's say, and an era that began with the Enlightenment, called the modernity and the modern state. And with it came to being the understanding of the state in terms of what was back then called republicanism, and what we nowadays call liberal democracy. So I could observe this problem with the rise and the spread through globalization of the neoliberal order. I could see that this so-called liberal order, through the means of its liberalism, basically eats itself from within. There is a certain implosion, or self-destructive movement that shrinks its horizons, its form, and its tendencies to what is, in fact, a kind of an authoritarianism. Before we talk about illiberalism of the likes of Salvini and Orban, for example, let's remind ourselves of the UK around 2010, the student protest, the reaction there, the austerity, the phenomenon of austerity, so many things that kind of, so recent in the past, but have been replaced by other political preoccupations. We kind of tend to forget were in place. The state was pretty strong there in maintaining a certain order in the society that was supposed to abide to a model whose only function was basically to maintain the economy and the possession of wealth and distribution of wealth, as it was, through in fact authoritarian means, while using the typical strategy of liberalism, not strategy typical of the model of liberalism we're talking about, Western liberalism, whereby you're supposed to interiorize and adhere to these principles, and believe that in fact you kind of like and agree with these policies, and you endorse them. While austerity, we have to do it for the greater good, etc., etc., etc. It was very easy back then to see that this is an authoritarian move. Then we have this kind of lapse of memory for half a decade, and then people like Viktor Orban and others emerge and start talking about illiberal democracy. And because we're talking about Orban, it's supposed to be nonsense, right? He is not capable of defining the regime that he's propagating. Well, I went to some kind of serious analysis. I took him seriously. I took him by his word, and I decided to analyze back in the time when we had a similar regime here. And those regimes are called, hybrid regimes. and did a comparative analysis and analyzed his, ideology, which is perhaps not laid out in some huge books or elaborate manifestos, but there are speeches that kind of sketch out what he means by that. And when he surprised Angela Merkel at this press conference in 2015, stating that there is such thing as a liberal democracy, and she was in kind of shock, I decided that I should take him seriously and really look closely at what he's talking about. Well, what the man was talking about is something that he's actually doing, or something that Erdogan has been doing for quite a while. In fact, the form of democracy, which is in fact the structure of and the dialectics, like let's say, of parliamentarism, is an empty form. You can, from in structural terms, you can look at it as an really an empty form, or a certain signifier, a structure which is not filled out with semantics, with content of a certain meaning, particular meaning, and you can fill it up with these or that type of meaning, and it could indeed be democratic or anti-democratic, liberal or anti-liberal, or even anti-democratic, if you retain the form, the empty form, but the value system behind the so-called democracy, which is supposed to be a more immediate representation of the citizen, or with a capital C, or citizenship, if that's kind of evacuated from this form, then you really retain what is technically democracy. This is what I'm talking about. But that's least of the concern here. The concern here is that what Orban said would expunge from this form of parliamentary democracy was liberalism and liberal ideas. And because we were the left, we were supposed to say nothing about it, because we hate liberalism as well, right? So what are we to do? So we started convincing Orbanites, the adherents of Orban and all forms of illiberalism on this planet, or at least on this continent, and especially in this region of Southeast Europe, where Orban's influence is really rising from Slovenia down to here. We started convincing the opposition that they are not what they claim to be. There's something else, of course, because it's not about liberalism, it's about this, it's about that. Even though they're telling you clearly, we want to get rid of liberalism, liberal values, that's it. So I thought to myself, while preparing for a talk in Brooklyn in the States, where the then to be Democratic Socialists of America invited me to talk, I started to prepare a speech about a talk. Actually, it was a lecture about this, and it was really difficult to explain what is this thing, illiberalism. It was really difficult to convince them that there is such a doctrine that should be taken seriously. And then we were really in trouble finding a language to criticize this phenomenon, because we were not liberals. So I decided to look at the liberal tradition in the most classical sense of the word. I decided to look up places in Marx's original text where he discusses liberalism and see what his issue with it is, or may be, and came to this realization that Marx had an issue with liberalism for it not being radical enough, for not being liberal enough, not being, the agency of freedom for humanity in its full sense. One of the most telling texts from Marx on this issue is, surprisingly, one might not think that we would find most of the material there, but this on it's the paper on the Jewish family and the division and the split basically between the state and the society. Where he insists that there should be some immanent link between the state and the society, and here is his famous, formula that at a certain point of time, the state should disappear basically as a form of organization, and we should end up with a society with a social contract and all that functions better than the system of the modern state. So that's why he criticizes Hegel's theory of the state there as being bourgeois, because it sustains the split between society and the state. The two ought to have a more organic link, and this organic link would enable greater emancipation for humanity as well, according to him there. So this is kind of early Marx, but we find passages that come from the later stage, and all this archaeology of statements along the lines of this argument I'm presenting about Marx have been assembled by a French, relatively young, I guess, researcher Pauline Clochet, that I wasn't aware of until I started working on this paper and a couple of other papers on a similar topic. So let's see how this discourse has been set up since the fall of the Berlin Wall, since the fall of our former socialist states, countries, I would say, states and societies, what emerged afterwards, and what type of Western Marxism became the model for us, and at the center of it, of course, the so-called post-Marxism, and what's it all about. So here I'll read a little bit so that I'm more systematic than I was up to this point. As soon as the ideal of globalization rose to prominence and the neoliberal global order deterritorialized, as the Deleuzians would put it, the entire territory of the globe, so spread on the globe, supposedly being trans-territorial, above the physical, above the geographical, ethereal, right? Supposedly, and the Berlin Wall fell. So all this coincides, and the end of history was declared. If you remember, we reached the point when history reached its fulfillment, and we were not supposed to expect anything in the future, which would be possibly a different form of political organization or political system. So all this happened at that time. Our societies and states, our state, Yugoslavia, fell apart, right? And the system that was called socialism or communism disappeared. So we started becoming westernized civilized according to the Western model, and we started for a decade or so, maybe more, we avoided Marxism altogether as a topic. It was like, you know, an improper issue, an embarrassing topic. How was it called, this cultural intimacy, this shame, yeah. So it was a matter of cultural intimacy that we would avoid and wouldn't talk of the matter until it became safe enough. Many of us, of our former republics, or many of the countries that formed that federation and the neighbors around joined the European Union, or some of us are stuck like us along the way, but sufficiently stuck in the integration process to consider ourselves practically there. So it became safe again to talk about the matter, to utter the word Marxism, but from a Western perspective. So we kind of did this with some sort of unexamined spontaneity, and I thought it appropriate for this occasion to see what stands behind the term post-Marxism, who coined it, and with what goal, and how does this coinage of the term coincide with the neoliberal global rise, and also how does whether it does actually the postmodern post-Marxist, which coincides with the postmodern discourse, overlaps with the whole logic of what was happening globally in terms of economy. I mean neoliberalism, of course, and its global form, or the phenomenon of globalization. Whether these two things somehow not just coincided, but converged, post-structuralism and this globalization phenomenon we're talking about. And mind you, this is a period when, you know, communism was over, or the attempt of communism in our former states. So at that point, we, the failed communist societies, admitted our moral defeat and conceded to the call out of the post-Marxists, such as Alasdair MacIntyre. And this is a quote from him: Marxism had failed morally. Apparently more so than the West. So we have apparently failed morally more so than the West. This is my comment to MacIntyre. So MacIntyre's critical project seems to rely on all but Marxism, from what I studied, and it was boring, but I studied him closely. So Aristotle, Nietzsche, and very little, if any, Marx or Marxism. Whereas his main charge against Marxism and the charge of its failure, for its failure against it, was stated to be the fact that it remained to, or maybe it became, according to him, but his phrasing, this is a quote, a paraphrase. His statement is, it remained too liberal. So mind you, MacIntyre, all this Aristotle, Nietzsche in the mix there, very little Marxism, he accuses the East of remaining too liberal and thereby failing as a socialist experiment. Therefore, when it comes to the admission of Marxism's failure, there is an overlooked misunderstanding between us in the East and the post-Marxists of the West. Whereas we in the East have believed for so long we had failed because of the bureaucratized and alienated state. So we have believed that to be the reason. Suppression of the freedom of expression, amongst other things, we thought that this was the era. If this was remedied, maybe socialism would have survived. Interestingly, the West thinks we were too liberal. So, whereas we in the East have believed for so long, we had failed because of the bureaucratized and alienated state and its suppression of freedom of expression, is totalitarianism, put simply. MacIntyre and his acolytes accuse our former political system of the opposite, of being too liberal. Interesting. Let us note that MacIntyre's entire premise is not derived from the assumption that the mode of production had not moved away substantially from the liberal model. This is not his reproachment to our model that failed. That is, we function through wage labor and commodity production. No, this was not what he reprimanded about. His reprimand is that the underlying reason for the failure is the ethos, morality of the former communist states. Its morality, which has remained too liberal, supposedly. Apparently, by the way, again, parenthesis, I think that the whole problem why we cannot conceive of any form of revolution or radical change or whatever right now, it's this, is the fact that the discourse we can operate is its hands are so tied by this moralist discourse, it cannot think politically. We cannot think politically properly. So, and this is the archaeology of how we ended up at this point. What I'm just talking about here, which is happening in the 80s, this critique, 80s, 90s, post-Marxism. So apparently, we remained too liberal. Apparently, insufficient totalitarianism has led communism to its moral failure, according to MacIntyre, rather than a historic failure related to the mode of production. Sadly, the Anglo-American interpretation of Marxism's failure, declared almost simultaneously with Fukuyama's declaration of the end of history, has become the paradigm of the global radical left critique of liberalism, based on very little Marx and lots of Aristotle, as well as very little political economy and lots of ethics and morality. Then again, Marx and Engels have emphasized repeatedly that communism is not about any form of morality, but rather about social organization, cultural transformation, and perhaps moral revalorization that would ensue from an economy that would not be based on wage labor. As Takahisa Oishi, Frank can pronounce it better, demonstrates in his meticulous exegesis of Marx's original text, reconstructing a unity of a rather fragmented argument there. The following statement could not be more unequivocal. This comes from Marx. Then we will arrive at Oishi. So the following statement that I am about to cite, and I just labeled as unequivocal, comes from Marx directly, Capital and Labor. The communists do not preach morality at all, as Stirner does so extensively. They do not put to people the moral demand, love one another, do not be egoists, etc. On the contrary, they are very well aware that egoism, just as much as selflessness, is in definite circumstances a necessary form of the self-assertion of individuals. And without this, you don't have revolutionary collective subjectivities. Hence, the communists by no means want, as Saint Max, they call Stirner Saint Max. Hence, the communists by no means want, as Saint Max believes, to do away with the private individual for the sake of the general selfless man. Let me reread it because it's kind of not clear maybe. So they conclude in opposition to Max Stirner. Hence, the communists by no means want, as Saint Max believes, to do away with the private individual. The communists do not want to do away with the private individual for the sake of the general. You know how much Marx hates generalizations as abstractions as a question of method. We have this discussion in Grundrisse there about the assemblages of concreteness, but never mind, that's a different topic. So the communists do not want to do away with the private individual for the sake of the general selfless man. End of quote. Oish's reading of Marx on the matter of morality as being one of the materializations in the form of social relations of the different modes of production leads to the conclusion that the socialist economic foundation comprised of associations of individual workers provides the basis for a possible new ethics. This thesis is further explored by Igor Brod, I can't pronounce this last name, in his 2019 publication, which prefers an important addition and further corroboration of Oish's main thesis. It is important to note that Oish undertakes a painstaking task of distinguishing Marx's enunciations and arguments from those present in Engels' interpretation and offer the following formulaic summarization. He even has a formula under the quote. So the French, he says, the French version begins with the capitalist mode of production and of appropriation that corresponds to it and omits the free workers, the French version of the text of the Capital. The present German and English versions were written or modified by Engels. As far as we can distinguish a mode of appropriation from its basis and understand it in its context, we cannot agree with Düring more. Individual private property, as founded on the labor of its proprietor, is negated by capitalist private property. We are talking about properties, but they're of a different form. And this is enabled through law and legality. Okay, so individual private property as founded on the labor of the proprietor is negated by the capitalist private property, which rests on the exploitation of alien but formally free labor, and then by individual property on the basis of cooperation and the free workers' possession of in common of the land and the means of production produced by labor itself. This quotes from Marx that are put together in a paraphrase of Oish's offered in this quote I'm reading. So thereby we arrive at something he calls social property. So he proposes the following. Let us formulate this and compare it with that of Engels. So kind of he puts Marx against Engels. Marx, individual property equals social property negates common property. Negates the opposite of equal. Engels, individual property is not equal, negates in a way social property, but is equal to common property. It's, you can see in the app, if you can open it. We're so fancy, we don't have pretend versions. You can see the formula here if you can open the app. So a very different equation here, Marx and Engels, thanks to three different, one original in German and two different translations. So Oish's philological and philosophical reconstruction of Marx's argument seems to me, as someone who was born and reached adulthood in Yugoslavia, more in tune with what I remember my former country set as its horizon, and where our collective post-communist self feels, at least in a predominant fashion, to have failed. In other words, more liberty would have been considered as bringing us closer to the communist ideal through the form of self-management characteristic of the latest stage of Yugoslavia's economic development. Such spontaneous interpretation or reminiscence on my part would be in line with Pauline Kloschek's brilliant analysis of Marxist liberalism, which manages to demonstrate that what Marx sought to accomplish through his critique of bourgeois liberalism was full radicalization of the most basic tenet of the liberal ideal, that of liberty embodied by individuals and collectives in an inextricable manner. So the one and the other, the individual and the collective, are two sides of the same coin that is called liberty. The one does not cancel the other. So the very possibility of criticizing liberalism and liberal values while having different and even opposing reference in mind. So we use the term, but we think of different things when the left and when Orban criticizes liberalism. So having opposing reference in mind speaks of the fact that the notion is multifaceted and embedded in different political traditions and doctrines. For example, Viktor Orban's attack on academic liberties because they're unpatriotic, sponsored by George Soros, and seeking to undermine European civilization is incomparable with the Western progressive left's critique of liberalism that seeks to radicalize individual, gendered, and multicultural self-expression. So we're using the same term, but thinking different, even opposing things. Returning, which is a testament to the fact that the term itself and its intellectual traditions are multifaceted and complex. Returning to Marxism, let us note that what Marx and his disciples have been tackling all along is the possibility to imagine freedom, liberties, and arguably rights, as well as das Recht, as in rule of law, in communism, as well as engage in critique of bourgeois liberalism. It seems like Marxist scholarship has been able to conceive of some generic notions of freedom, liberty, and of a sublated version of liberalism, emerging from the contradictions of capitalism and bourgeois society in a dialectical and historically determined manner. In such a generalization, if such a generalization is inapplicable to the entire legacy or to all of the legacies of Marxism, it certainly is, I would argue, applicable to Marx's own writings. I am basing this argument on the convincing exegesis of authors, exegesis in plural, of authors such as Oishi and Kloschek, to name only a few, but also on Marx's oeuvre itself. And in particular, some of the writings that I mentioned, some of the coming from the earlier stage of his oeuvre, others from the later. So For example, on the Jewish question, the Holy Family, Grundrisse, but not only those. So we are thus brought to the matter at hand and its context at the turn of the third decade of the 21st century. In an era of rising illiberalisms or authoritarianism or populist authoritarianisms, as they're called, but I don't think that they grasp the definition. So in an era of rising illiberalisms of different sorts, and possible further suspension of rights due to phenomena such as the prolonged COVID pandemic, or maybe other pandemic in the future, or some other global state of emergency. Are we not faced with the challenge to defend some very generic freedoms, such as the freedom to move? How are we to do so beyond the already irreparable language of liberalism? How are we to do so without or beyond the language of liberalism, because it's irreparable? Can we speak a new language of freedom and of specific yet rather general liberties? And is it possible to do so by way of discarding the entire history of liberalism and its fundamental concepts? This is a question. To be clear, I'm not advocating unreasonable defiance of, for example, the pandemic containment control or anything of the sort, or anything that can be likened to this situation. I'm not saying that we should put our right to freely displace our bodies and enjoy social and physical interaction at the expense of the collective health. My warning is that with the now past pandemic, hopefully past pandemic, or similar situations of a global scale can be abused in order to limit some of said basic and apparently generic forms of freedom. In fact, warnings of abuse of the pandemic for the democratic backsliding, and imposing of authoritarian rule have arrived as early as in the spring of 2020 by a Swedish institute that followed this phenomenon. Whether the state of exception was being abused in Europe, I think only. I mean, the continent. Therefore, we could say there is a twofold pressing reason to invent a language of freedom that will transcend the confines of liberal traditions, both its affirmations and its critiques, as aspects of the same historic given. Furthermore, Marxist radicalization of the liberal core found in the discussions of the young Hegelians, as demonstrated by Paul and Kloschek, has been taken beyond the bourgeois status quo and its material economic foundation, provides the means for it. If we could build on exegesis such as that of Kloschek or other similar authors, and there are not many of that kind, but still they exist. So in order for such a radicalization of the concept to take place, one ought to create the conditions for the first prerequisite to take place, the transformation of the mode of production, whereby the means of production would be seized by associations of individual producers. For example, this is an example. The point is that it must start from a kind of a transformation of the mode of production. If at the present point in time such possibility seems utopian, let us recall Marx himself argued that the associations of free producers could appear within the capitalist model. Namely, in the first volume of Capital, Marx states that individual private property is the foundation of small-scale industry, and the small-scale industry is a necessary condition for the development of social production and of the free individuality of the worker himself. The expansion of the small-scale industry of associations of free workers would deepen the capitalist contradiction, and so the contradiction is in place. It may not be the transformative paradigm, but they could deepen the contradiction within the capitalist state as it is, and finally lead to its resolution and to a transformation of the political economic paradigm. Such very material freedom is premised on the mere physical freedom of movement and establishing of social relations. It is a historical struggle, but I do not see a reason to view historical transformations and progressions as necessarily linear. Therefore, reclaiming language of liberty in the face of rising authoritarianisms and the transformation of the mode of production could take place by following the laws of both synchrony and diachrony, as the structuralists would put it, as Claude Lévi-Strauss would put it. If the present paradigm is in crisis and the germs of the new possibilities emerge from this very entropy, islands of potentialities exist at both the economic plane as well as that of the social relations, both of them seen as unequivocally material. Off talk. Thank you. Thank you. So we will continue with the discussion immediately, right?
Yeah. So I will moderate here.
Okay. I think for someone to call me out as a covert liberal. Zdravko is about to do so.
If there is nobody willing before him.
He always does that.
Yeah. Just a second.
Marx as some kind of totalitarian thinker, as some liberals try to do, and Katerina has explained that struggle for freedom is very important part of the Marx thought. But I want to stress that when opposed to bourgeois liberalism, what is normally called liberalism, the opposite of that is not normally totalitarian collectivism and so on, the Marx thought, but not the term which would be best is not something like socialist liberalism, but Marxist humanism, because, and this is the term that was used in the Marxist tradition. Just to remind that from 1960s especially, but even before, some Marxist thinkers were stressing that something in building socialism is not right. It is not only if you nationalize the economy, but Marxism is something more than that. It is transformation of societies and bringing different kind of human relations in that new society. And what is very obvious in the Marx thought, it is not only economic philosophical manuscripts that were known quite late, after a century, but one of the most famous Marxist book, the Communist Manifesto, you have explicitly there that we want to change this society with a society where pre-development of the individual is a precondition of pre-development of all. And here you have the key concept of Marxist humanism. So it starts from the individual, not from the collective. If the collective is free, then we are free. But from the individual, but it is not freedom of the individual brings freedom of the collective, but some different category of freedom, pre-developed, and this is something that is liberal, but it is not totally liberal. It is humanist. It is going beyond the separation of individualism and collectivism. So, is it Marxism for individualism or for collectivism? Marxism is for humanism. Is for transcending the opposition of the individual self-interest and general will. It is general interest. It is connecting them. It is going from. It is like becoming one of the whole, but not losing itself in that. So it is quite important issue, and it is very important also not to bring Marxism to some kind of current of liberalism going from enlightenment, but also not like a totalitarian thought that is prioritizing the whole on behalf of the individual. So it is different. It is humanism, not individualism or collectivism.
I agree, and you're right. It's way too often reduced to economic critics, etc., etc. But there are later writings on this, in particular, the manifesto confirms that this is an idea that stuck with him or them, but him in particular, throughout his entire work, activity, both as an author and somebody involved in one way or another in politics. My worry is that if we stick to the term humanism, then we have to deal with the anti-humanist, let's say, Althusserian, post-Althusserian critique, which is to be taken seriously by of the humanist understanding of Marx, especially by, for example, the Praxis group, the way they embraced it. Then we do live in an era of the so-called post-humanism, and the critique of anthropocentrism may be necessary and justified. So we probably have to, I mean, I agree with the general tone of your concept. I'm just worried about the term and proposing that maybe we should come up with a notion that will not be anthropocentric in this respect. That's all I'm saying. Other than that, I agree with the general idea presented. So non-inspirational. I like Frank.
I think it was very inspirational. That's why I'm trying to think of questions.
Maybe we're just tired.
From my viewpoint, it's been yes.
Studied the history of the British Liberal Party or the liberal movement, and with William Gladstone, what we see from the start is the classical liberalism in its crudest sense, civil liberties, and that's about it. But then actually there is quite an interesting statement by a professor in Nietzsche saying that the first liberal prime minister was actually a social democrat. So by the time the liberal party won power after transforming from the Whigs, it had essentially become a social democratic party in all its essence. So David Lloyd George, H. Zetsky, Henry Campbell Bannerman, I think was the third one. All of them were more social democrats. So, and afterwards, as eventually dissolved as a major political blocking, a lot of the liberals went to the conservatives, but it was interesting. It usually happened due to national issues, such as Irish Home Rule or the First World War or the Second World War with Churchill. But a lot of the other liberals went to the Labour Party and went to the, let's say, more mainstream socialist views. Why am I saying this is interesting for me, and I think with your previous conversation with Frank, you've touched upon this subject in terms of culture. And from what we see, especially with the advent of liberalism, in my point, I was doing research in terms of international political economy and how this once trade agreement stopped becoming simple interactions on the border. Daniel Roderick writes about this, about regulatory harmonization, about economic regulation and harmonization of regulation. People actually started voting against their own self-economic interests. And that was the case with NAFTA in the States when Clinton was trying to pass that. So what was interesting in that viewpoint is that it defeats the core liberal premise of individuals being able to discern what their own economic interest is, economic self-interest, and then following it correctly. So with that advent of the school of constructivism in international relations and international political economy, what we see and what's been proven by I think it's been the project of Thomas Piketty in this sense. It's very crucial to look at the values people share and how, in a sense, the fight against liberalism, especially the one propagated by Orban and company, is a values-based fight in a liberal democracy. Also, with the previous talk, what we had was China, the Enlightenment premise of liberal democracy coupled with economic free enterprise as the only possible combination. What we see in China is the potential to have economic self-enterprise coupled with illiberal forms of government, the totalitarian forms of government. So in its essence, I think we are moving, when speaking about the liberal phenomenon, the thing you did the moving toward explaining, we are moving from the simple economic sphere and the division between them, and we are moving as a towards the values and the cultural sphere. And I think that would be a fight even harder to fight because, especially what started in international politics, but we have the domestic politics and cancel culture and all the rest, cultural wars, tribalism, and everything else. So my question, we have a question in the end, was perhaps did the former socialist Marxist societies, called them what you want in Eastern Europe, fail because they were too illiberal? As opposed to what MacIntyre says, they were too liberal for business.
I think they became too bureaucratized, maybe too authoritarian as well. If there is suppression, if I don't know, dialogue critique is impossible, basically. For example, you participate in the socialist ideal, but you can't say anything which goes against the party line. You're a dissident, automatically an enemy of the state. Most of the people who ended up in jail for political reasons were actual socialists. They just followed a different line of socialism. So I think that, yes, the suppression of freedom of expression, individual freedom. So unlike MacIntyre, I believe it was the opposite. That this is what caused the increasing sense of collective frustration, which maybe led to the societies and the states falling apart, and the level of bureaucratization, whereby the state becomes something alien, something oppressive, something threatening. So it's not your state, it's not the dictatorship of the proletariat. If you're afraid of this system, I think that McIntyre is not right, and the situation was exactly the opposite. But I believe that the change happens only through the change of the economic system, the mode of production. By saying so, I'm not being an economic reductionist. I don't think that, because if I were, I would believe that values and whatever belief systems, etc., are free floating, detached from the material and productive base. I don't think so. I think that they are intrinsically linked. But I think that this naive philosophical moralism of Aristotelian kind, where people will reform themselves and they will become enlightened and form a new type of subjectivity and suddenly, change themselves from within and change the world, the culture and value system. I don't believe in that. I believe that the material foundation has to be changed. The problem with capitalism is, it goes actually in the direction of completely, supposedly, presumably on the level of pure phantasm, dematerializing whatever it produces. That's how we arrived at this speculative economy, the bubbles, etc., etc. There's this tendency to negate that the physical material production plays a role, that it's something to be taken into consideration as part of the equation as to how we produce both material and other forms of value. It's simply a system of value production. And now, it's a system of value production that produces surplus value, that has a tendency to constantly produce surplus value, that we tend to believe, this is a kind of a belief system, capitalism. We tend to believe it's independent completely from what's going on physically, material. Which is simply not the case, and that is what in these philosophical writings actually becomes the subject of Marx's critique, and the critique of Hegel as well. He believes that that's naive to think that everything is spiritual completely detached from the physical. The physical is irrelevant. In the last instance, dialectically to be annihilated entirely by the very dialectic he advocates in his phenomenology. So this becomes a subject of Marx's critique, and he believes that this metaphysics, well, I am paraphrasing, I am choosing this word to simplify the discussion, but there is a certain metaphysics behind capitalist setting, how the system works, how the world operates, including the process of economic production, of material creation of whatsoever kind. And at the core of it lies the naivete, the naive belief that you could simply emancipate the value, all kinds of value, monetary value, the value of commodities, so value in the economic sense, but also value systems, or as belief systems, that you can completely detach them from anything physical or anything material. That's why his equation MCM, in the end, he says it will accelerate. This process will accelerate. commodity, it's in the second or third volume, capital, I can't remember. It will accelerate, and at a certain point, the C, commodity, in the middle will disappear. Why? Because it's interested only in value production. So the process of selling, trading, etc., will accelerate to a degree where value will produce more value. So out of value will you get pure out of pure value you get more pure value. But he says there is a contradiction there in the reality of it, and this belief system is flawed. It's an idealist belief system because actually you cannot produce value out of value. I mean, you do practice that in capitalism. That's how it's sustained. It's an entire metaphysics around a certain dialectic of values. But the naivete and the final contradiction in this system is to underestimate the real and physical foundation of all of it. I think that with this, for example, climate emergency, we're facing that. Nothing is ethereal, obviously, and our world is falling apart because we don't know, because we underestimate nature as a nation, in a way. It becomes resource. So there is a philosophy, metaphysics behind it. This contempt toward the physical, toward the material, it's just a resource. So his proposition is far more complex. It's not only about economy. You reverse the economy, but you reverse the economy because you come to this, philosophical realization that you cannot underestimate materiality, physicality, etc., to such an extent, because it can only accelerate the contradiction that is inherent to the system, that is bound to fall apart because due to this contradiction. Because this is coarse materiality will always kind of make this setup of specters that capitalism just crumble. So that's how it's, even when he talks about economy, it's actually a discussion about metaphysics. Zoom room is Zoom.
I see that there is no question from the panel, the Zoom panel.
Maybe like previous visions that you talked about where there was a name to them in the past. This anarcho-liberal. Oh yeah, which is very funny.
There was also the crime of liberalism. Anarcho-liberals and liberals.
Anarcho-syndicalist.
Anarcho-syndicalistiski, ne, anarcho-syndicalist. Ta grupa
Yeah. Well, you kind of answered my question on the previous thing. I wanted to press some more on that. What we're saying there that liberalism has kind of had a monopoly on the discourse on the language when it comes to freedom and liberty. And then what has to be done is that to distract, not to distract them, but to reclaim the language from the language of liberty from them. Do you think that that's the only method, that's the only way that the leftists or Marxists should go on when it comes to reclaiming that language of freedom or the discourse in this sense? Or do you think that also applying Marxism has also had their own issues that you mentioned, that they were too naive, or in that sense that they were kind of metaphysical of how to apply Marxism or how they percepted it. And in that sense, freedom, as they saw, Isaac being criticized them that it was very positivistic sense, a very positivistic freedom. That's why they have too much correlation with nationalism. So communist nationalism, they have correlation in every sense that it was applied because it was positivist.
So your question is, do we have to build on or take from the tradition of liberalism at all, or some?
So is it more leftist fault or more liberal fault?
Even if it's the left's fault that or the liberalism's fault that what failed, the discourse of freedom.
Yeah. So the liberals were saying that have monopolized the language. Is that the case? Or the other case is that the Marxism was not applied properly, or in itself it was not meant to be banished.
Yes. Well, that goes in the past, and I guess it's both as far as past is concerned. The question is, what is to be done now? If we should build on those traditions, if we can extract tenets from the traditions of liberalism, some of them. Years ago, I started collecting writings from, some classical liberals that, sounded completely, Marxist, socialist, which was surprising. So there is something there, and we should not forget that Marx built on some of them, like Rousseau, Diderot, whatever. So there must be some relevance there. It's always wrong to begin from scratch as ex nihilo. So something from there can be derived, but we do not need to, be exclusive about it. I mean, there are other traditions of thought which just haven't experimented with it. Want to operate with as intellectual material and this reinvention of a language of freedom that we're talking about. It's rather uncharted territory.
Yes, that is why they continue. I don't think that it's fair now what the leftism is going, how they have monopolized the left in itself and combine it with populism. For example, voices that are more, let's say, academical, let's call them, like for example, in your position, people of the general opinion don't associate leftism with you, but they all associate leftism with the political party base, which is not properly connected to what they're preaching or building. Do you think that that's fair in this sense? And what should be done so that we discard the political party and how they apply leftism with what political academia is preaching on leftism?
Well, academia, what leftist academia currently looks like, is very much aligned with, this mainstream culture. I would say progressive mainstream culture on the international scale, or at least in the West, including us as well in that West, the tradition, the continent, etc. And I think that that's predominant. What I'm saying, or what Frank is saying, is so fringe. I mean, you won't find, it well from many academics who teach. Even in my regular teaching to students, when it's not informal like this, when it's class, I don't teach like this. So, here we can, it's an informal setting. An informal time school a bit more, at least more free, especially on undergraduate. You kind of create pockets of critique for the students, but you adhere mainly to the mainstream discourse, or you're trying to sound as neutral as you can because you're just performing some pedagogical duty. So even we don't do it as part of our regular work in academia. So I don't think that there's much potential there. On the other hand, you're right. The left what proclaims to be the left or the radical left is becoming increasingly populist. Well, this populism has been supported by many scholars. I mean, there have been many papers building on like law, rules, etc. Celebrating left populism. Even I was there, so supporting the same naively. So yeah, I don't know what's become the left. Academia is the parties. I don't think what's become the left is very far from what socialism is supposed to be. That's what I would conclude. I think that these terms have become very, very different now. But I don't know if I'm right. You know, too strong of a statement.
Someone else has. So I was inspired by the last colleague in his question, and I think that there is another angle to give some additional thought in the discussion about the language of modifying signifiers and so on. And I think that we should look what maybe the side that is critiqued, what's happening there. For example, beyond this, what is happening to left critique, academia, and so on, what's happening on the other side? I apologize for using that term, us and them. It's not my point. So let me get to my point. I think that today, conspiracists' way of thinking has become a way of political engagement. So this kind of conspiracy theories has become also of not only the main groups, but as a way of political participation. So we see that kind of political participation that is so massive, that is deciding elections and that is deciding policies. Sometimes we have that kind of in Macedonian case with the reform of education. There was this massive conspiracy kind of driven political participation. So this is not a conspiracy theory that it's kind of esoteric part of the society. No, it's going in the public sphere, even formally with organizations and so on. And so I would like to bring the aspect of the post in the discussion, because I think that it's overarching and we didn't mention it. But I would like to mention in the sense of social stratification and the creation of maybe what I would call lumpen bourgeoisie, but not lumpen bourgeoisie from the sense of in the beginning of colonial times, this flag that was pulling in the countries that were colonists and was enjoying the status, but lumpen bourgeoisie in kind of epistemic way. Because I don't think that we should, in terms of action and taking action as academics, as activists, only in terms of social issues, but also in epistemic issues. Not only the redistribution of capital, of resources, but also redistribution of knowledge, of thinking about epistemic injustice. Let me use the term of Miranda Figure, philosopher. So what about, what do you think, is it posed through a symptom of capitalism, a totalitarian side of capitalism, or is this too much theorizing, although I like too much theorizing, but nevertheless?
I think it is a symptom of something that they're being wrong. Obviously, we consider this, we call these people conspiracy theorists. Sometimes there is complete nonsense, and it is conspiracy theory that's bonkers, but it doesn't make any sense. But even behind those, there is something that should be given credit and taken into serious consideration instead of dismissing these people. Then you have this level of conspiracy theory where the theory is not completely nuts, like with our educational reform. The people were paranoid that this reform toward digitalization hides, right, a certain plan to smuggle in a historiography, a narrative, national narrative that goes in favor of, the Bulgarian narrative, and it's all a big plan of the EU so that they get us in. So that was the theory. But this theory is not so nonsensical. So people were more paranoid than proper conspiracy theorists. So there is a degree of this collective paranoia that either creates its theories as to what's behind it. They need some sort of explanation, some sort of a solution to the cognitive dissonance they're in. Something is going on. There is a sense of distrust in the system, but they don't have an explanation of it. So they create all sorts of narratives for it. But I would take it as a symptom of a really toxic relationship between societies, I would say, the societies of this our global contemporaneity and the systems that rule us, the state, not only the state, but parts of society. I don't know. Those who are the bearers of knowledge, authority, like the media, like academia, etc. They simply don't trust us. They don't trust us. I remember how much I was advocating for this reform, educational reform, thinking that that's finally, proper, interdisciplinary, etc., etc., etc. Then I was at the time, now I'm reconsidering some parts of it, a fervent adherent to this idea that the more digitalization, the more the less destruction of nature. So I was like advocating for this and offering all these sorts of arguments. I could see that nobody believes it. No, they don't believe me. They see me as the instrument of the government or whatever. So academia, the state, etc., whatever is perceived as mainstream, those who control the discourse of authority, they're not trusted by the general population. So post-truth is, like a cynical misuse or use of certain postmodern, post-structuralist theories around discourse, discursivity, constructedness, etc., of whatever truth is. It is almost cynical, as if a joke, as if taken from the left and sent back to the saying in your face. There is post-truth. So it's like, a really ugly joke, but a joke that is a symptom of what I was just talking about. So there's the serious alienation between states, whatever they are, liberal, China, wherever, and just the regular golden society. Yeah, but she spoke here. She spoke at the same school 2 years ago. I don't know if she mentioned the conspiracies there, but that's a topic she likes, because of this.
Okay, last question.
I want to comment because it is quite important point that he has made about appropriation of or privatization of the discourse of freedom by the liberals. It is much sharing about propaganda that liberalism is seen as an ideology of freedom or the only ideology of freedom. For example, anarchism will disagree strongly. They are as much ideology of freedom as they are of equality. So freedom is very important part of the anarchist or libertarian socialist thinking. So liberalism doesn't have a monopoly of fight for freedom, and even more importantly, it is quite hypocritic in their fight for freedom. For example, and we should expose its hypocrisy. For example, see the conception of free world versus the totalitarian world. That free world of liberals included, for example, Pinochet Chile, included Saudi Arabia, included Israel, Singapore, and a lot of authoritarian, extremely authoritarian states. So what if free world includes Saudi Arabia? What is liberals' concept of freedom? Or see the concept of rule of law. If you have huge inequalities in capitalist states, then you will have a part of the population, the rich, the capitalists, who have enough money to bribe the politicians, the judges. So you cannot have rule of law because you're not addressing the issue of inequality in the state. But they are hoping that even though they are not addressing the issue of inequality, they can have magically the rule of law. Or one freedom that liberals are very afraid of. The freedom, the extension of our free time. Of this freedom and shortening workers' hours. Of this freedom, the liberals are scared as from the devil. So why is that? And what is saying this if they are scared for talking about extension of free time? And I don't know any liberal who is speaking about freedom in terms of let's broaden our freedom, let's shorten the working hours and extend our free time. Because liberalism has a strong barrier, and that is capitalism. What is when capitalism is breaking freedom, then liberalism stops to fight beyond that limit.
Yeah, I agree. This would be the main research. Okay, so it's the end.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Break.
Yeah, we're taking 15 minutes break for the Zoom participants. Use the last link for today. See you in 15 minutes. Thank you, Katerina, once again.